All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. Today is this is episode 104 of the PetroNerds podcast, and I am delighted to have a guest with me here today. This is sort of a cross promotional event and cross promotional podcast. But today it is March 15th. 2024. It is Friday. We just had a massive snowstorm in Denver and in the mountains, but it is sunny today. And I am here with my guest, Chris Brown from the Common Sense Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Trisha, it's amazing to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So Chris is I'll introduce him and we'll do the timestamps and we'll do the whole works. But Chris is with the Common Sense Institute, which if you've seen on LinkedIn and posts and Twitter, Common Sense Institute just brought me as an energy fellow, which I'm super, super pumped about. And we'll talk more about the Common Sense Institute. But this is really timely because Chris is the VP of Policy and Research at the Common Sense Institute in Colorado. He's going to tell us more about exactly what the Common Sense Institute is. And they brought me on as an energy fellow. And in a very short time period, Chris did a lot of the legwork for this, but I was a contributor to this recent paper on this bill in Colorado, which I've talked about in the previous podcasts and in LinkedIn commentary. It's the bill SB 24-159, and this is the ban on drilling and producing or drilling completions within the state of Colorado. So this is really a report that talks about the economic consequences of that. So we'll talk about that. I'm going to timestamp this, but Chris, welcome to the podcast, and really look forward to diving into all of this with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is very timely. As you mentioned, yesterday we had a big snowstorm that actually also put a damper and canceled the committee meeting for this bill, which we expect to come back here shortly. So this is incredibly timely for this audience.
Yeah, and this is great because we actually get to do this podcast in advance, and I always hesitate
Right.
because we're gonna have to come up with a clever title because I always want people outside of Colorado to listen to these Colorado focused ones, because Colorado is a lot like California, where it sets this precedent, for other states. If you don't think it can happen to you, it can happen to you, and I think it's really important to follow the energy production in Colorado, especially because we produce almost 500,000 barrels per day in this state, and this is all a risk. But with that, I'm going to timestamp this just really quickly. So right now on Friday, March 15th, 2024, we're looking at $80 and 59 cents for WTI. We saw this nice pop of 81, and there's a few different reasons for that. I'm going to let Chris, if he wants to, we can talk about the market stuff. Some guests love it, some guests don't. But Brent is at 85.21. We have Henry Hub at a abysmal $1.66 right now. That is important to talk about gas prices, and we will, because I do want to talk a little bit about electricity prices and what Excel is doing in Colorado, and just the ability for Colorado consumers to purchase electricity. Dutch TTF or European natural gas prices is well under $10. It's only $8.33. You're looking at Japanese LNG prices at only $8.49. And then the 10-year yield, which is also a big component of why I talk about this in the podcast a lot, but it's a big component of why we're seeing such volatility in oil prices. One of them is because the International Energy Agency came out yesterday with a report, and they reversed their line, thinking we would have a surplus, and they said we would have a deficit of crude. That was partly why we saw a pop yesterday, but it's also because we have the 10-year yield at a whopping 4.306%, which means your mortgages are well over 7% right now. And that is because we had two inflation reports this week. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which came in hotter than expected with sticky inflation, which we've known this has been sticky. I talk about it a lot. And we also we had sticky. The really thing that got the nail in the coffer was yesterday, the Producer Price Index, or the PPI, which was also hot. So all that's impacting this. And I think this stuff is actually really, really relevant and timely, because electricity prices and natural gas prices we're not seeing them in sync. And so it's the first time in a long time we're seeing these very high and rising electricity prices that are not seeing the benefit of these lower natural gas prices. So we don't have to get into I can talk about future podcasts, OPEC in the market. And if you want to comment, that'd be great. But I think we should open this up and really talk to folks about, the Common Sense Institute, the work you do, bringing me on as a fellow, and really this bill, what's going on in the state of Colorado with this SB 24159, and what's and then this paper that we put out on the economic consequences of this. So yeah. a lot to cover here. But really delighted to have you on. And where do you want to start? Do you want to start with telling us a little bit of background about you and the Common Sense Institute?
Yeah, why don't we do that? I mean, just what you went through is really just incredible, and I think really important context, and why a big reason I think we're excited to start working with you. I mean, at CSI, we study the economic and fiscal ramifications of a wide range of public policy issues. We're a free enterprise think tank that cares about analyzing and helping voters, business leaders, elected officials understand the economic ramifications of the issues that they are voting on, that they are seeing in their daily lives. Inflation and energy prices is obviously a big topic and a big issue, something we've studied for some time. But again, very excited to have your expertise and your insights as we talk about these issues going forward. So, I think, what the topic that brings us here today, as you mentioned, is this bill that was introduced a couple weeks back, is set to be heard before its first committee. So we'll understand its fate here shortly. But it's really a interesting time that we find ourselves in with a slot of regulation, a slot of onslaught of changes we've seen in the last 5 or so years here in Colorado. And now we see finally sort of a bill proposing to actually ban oil and gas production, something that we didn't really think would have been seriously contemplated, and yet here we are. So I want to get into that issue, but I do think there's a much broader context of energy cost to consumers that is something we want to continue to understand and analyze here in Colorado, along with some of the other states that we work in.
Yeah. So one, I think that's awesome, and I was really delighted to be invited to join you guys. It's an honor and an absolute pleasure as folks who listen. And as you guys know, I'm pretty pumped to be to work in the space and to bring the knowledge that I can and to help issues like this. So I love the nonpartisan, I love the sort of bipartisan approach as well, and the just getting intel and information out there. So it's that really sort of spiral up mentality of get more intel out there. So I think it's great. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, part of the reason of joining you guys, and I think why you invited, was because of all these serious issues going around, and the fact that energy touches everybody's lives. It touches every business. It's the people always say it's a sector, but it's actually it is the sector that underpins all businesses, and without energy you can't do business. And I think in Colorado, you made the point that we didn't think this would happen. I think maybe we should start with so how you guys are thinking about this. We can start with this current ban, which is a drilling completion ban. So I really do encourage listeners, and I will try to put this in the show notes, the link to the actual bill, because it's important to read through the bill. I talked about it on the last podcast. I read some out of it, but the actual bill, it's in my opinion, it's pretty poorly written. It's very thin. The emphasis is on emissions, but it also talks about pollution. There's some confusion there. And then it basically it's limiting the permits, or stopping all permitting for oil and gas drilling completion activity by 2030. But even before that, it's reducing that activity, or those allowed permits. And SB 181, which was the bill that passed, which severely has really restricted permit development and the ability to get permits in Colorado, has already had a huge impact to Colorado. So this is sort of this bill that, as you mentioned, a lot of folks didn't think it was going to happen. I think that a lot of us in the energy community, oil and gas community, saw it coming. I think folks saw this coming, or the desire for this to come down the pipeline. But I encourage folks to listen or to read this bill, because it's about basically reducing CO2 emissions. And as this report, the data that's in this report is really great, because it basically shows that it doesn't reduce emissions. So Chris, can you walk through your thinking on this? You have some initial comments and thinking on the bill, and then we'll get into the report.
Yeah, well, we at CSI, we've studied the economic impacts here on a couple issues. You mentioned Senate Bill 181, which did pass, which changed and overhauled the way in which oil and gas is regulated and permitted, granted new authorities on regulating at the local level. But we also studied Proposition 112. If you rewind back to 2018. Yep. It was the last measure we saw on a statewide ballot to increase the setback requirements, the setback distance requirements. There were some prior ones in years before, but we did a big study on that, analyzing the potential economic ramifications of that voters ultimately here in Colorado shot down. And so we've gone through several rounds of this. The oil and gas industry has seen many ramifications of this. I think the way going back to our initial conversation, talking about energy, talking about the connections between inflation, energy prices that consumers feel. I often talk about energy, and that old parable you've heard of the little fish that looks at his grandfather fish, and the grandfather says, the water's a little unclear today, and the little fish says, "What's water?" I think we often don't realize, we take energy for granted. We take the process, we take flipping on our lights for granted, and we don't understand entirely from policy context the ramifications of making pretty significant changes. And so I think that's sometimes where we find ourselves when we see these big sweeping bills that frankly are going to have impacts for decades and for hundreds of thousands of Coloradans.
Absolutely. No, you characterized that really well. So, okay, so the bill is to, the actual bill is to ban oil and gas drilling
Right.
and completion activity on the basis that the basis that it's written is that Colorado needs to reduce emissions, that Colorado has to get on board with the IEA's, the not the climate change executive order, but it has to get on board with the International Energy Agency, Paris Climate Accords, and everything. So that's the premise that the bill actually states. And then they say that Colorado actually doesn't need all this excess oil and gas production, and that we can ban oil and gas, the new drilling completion activity, but we can continue to produce oil and gas, and therefore we can continue to live off this. Now, as you know, I've been pretty vocal about the response to this because that's not exactly how businesses or economics work. But I think so the report that you put together and I contributed to was this report. So why don't you introduce that and sort of walk listeners through your thinking on this report? And also, listeners, keep in mind, I haven't got to know. I mean, I'm getting to know Chris now. Obviously, he's a wealth of knowledge, extremely articulate, and he put this, largely put the bulk of this paper together extremely quickly. So what Common Sense Institute, the response you have is just really rapid and really fast, which is awesome. And it's already something I think that you have to have numbers and you have to have data and facts for people to look to, not just folks in the industry, but outside the industry and businesses to say, what is the actual impact of something as, something as broad and sweeping as this, and does it actually impact emissions? And I think you say the answer is not. But can you walk folks through your thinking and how you stylize and put this report together?
Yeah, absolutely. So the analysis and the impacts that we measured, we quantified, that we put in here, as you said, really don't fully capture probably all ramifications and all permutations of the impacts. I think we talk about that and allude to some of the other aspects that would be important to quantify in a broader context. But what we focused on were the economic impacts related to this decline in production following the elimination, the ending of new permitting of new wells, the revenue implications of state and local property tax, sales tax, various revenue streams associated with mineral rights. We looked at the revenue implications and then the emissions impacts. Ultimately, and I think your listeners understand, but I think what we're trying to get across from an economic standpoint to policymakers, to the broader public, is if you eliminate the production and the supply of oil and gas from within Colorado, you don't fundamentally change the demand. You don't change the demand within the state or across the country. In the states, there was a greenhouse gas roadmap, a state report that was just put out weeks after this bill was introduced by the state's energy office, led by the governor's office, which echoed these remarks. And I'd encourage maybe listeners not familiar with that we quote that and we cite some of that. But the idea that you would fundamentally change demand is false. So fundamentally, when you would shift the supply, the production that is occurring, the hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil that you mentioned, 4% of the U.S. supply that would necessarily have to be produced somewhere else. What we looked at is the net change in emissions by producing that, let's say, outside of Colorado, which, according to U.S. EPA data, has a relatively low emission intensity. So the framework of the report and all of this analysis is built upon looking at a 10-year window, the last 10 years between 2014 and 2023, pulling state data, state production data, and saying, what if we had implemented this type of ban starting in 2014 and taking all production from wells spudded after 2014 out of the actual production volumes that we saw over that 10-year horizon. And we said, well, what if that was the amount of lost production we see between 2030 and 2039, again, as a result of this legislation? And then measured in a dynamic model that we use, developed by a company called Remy, modeled what those economic consequences would be. So over those 10-year window, we see growing to an 180,001 annual job loss by 2039, starting at about 34,700 jobs that would be lost in the first year. And then as the decline increases, as there's less and less production over that time period, grows to nearly 200,000 jobs lost statewide. We're also able to analyze the regional dynamics and understand those regional trends. 70% of the job loss would occur within the Denver metro. A significant amount of the production, majority of the production, all the production occurs in one county just north of the Denver metro in Weld County. But a large portion of the job loss, when you look downstream, both in the oil and gas extraction sector, there's a lot of services. A lot of those jobs are located within the Denver metro. Then you look at the service, the construction jobs impacted, the retail jobs impacted. The majority, 70%, more than 2 out of every 3 jobs lost would occur within Metro Denver. We measure the GDP impacts. In the long run, the GDP impacts would amount to more than a 5% reduction in our state's annual GDP, approaching $50 billion, sort of shaved off of the Colorado economy as a result. And so that's really just the economic side. I can maybe get into the revenue and the emissions, but maybe break down those jobs numbers. I don't know what stood out to you specifically, but ultimately this is a critical sector that is contributing a high amount of output, value added, that is contributing both to just firms that are directly in this business, but really a significant amount that are connected through the supply chain and rely on the incomes of oil and gas and related jobs, again, sort of downstream.
No, that's fantastic. Really, really good overview. And I think I always usually tell guests that they're more than welcome to, one, interrupt me, and two, also ask questions. So, if you want to just interject and, turn the tables, you're more than welcome to. Because I think this paper, it's really good. And I want to hone in on a few things, which is the actual revenue numbers, which is about almost $2 billion. So the revenue contribution of Colorado oil and gas is about $2 billion to the state. So one, it's an insurmountable feat to take that, to get that money back somewhere. The bill doesn't address that at all. Basically, they just say we'll continue to produce oil and gas and then we can consume that. They don't address the lost revenue. I don't like the fiscal notes that the state puts out because I think they're extremely limited. This one has, I think it's a few $100 million impact. It doesn't have the $2 billion, and so it doesn't include the state and local taxes. So that roughly $2 billion number is huge for the state, and I think that's so important because and something, we both, Chris and I, talked to a reporter with the Denver Gazette yesterday, and I tried to spend a little more time on this paper does a great job on the quant side and putting the numbers to it. But this bill and this industry and economics and business more broadly, you have to put, there's a lot of qualifications. There's a lot of subjective stuff an understanding of businesses that you can't just say, well, it's going to be a ban and here's how it will be, because there's a lot of externalities that we can't take into account. But I think the $2 billion, the revenue, the impact, the direct to schools, which is it's over $400 million that goes directly to schools. This is going to be really hard if this was to actually be put in place. What would happen just to the state revenue coffers and state coffers of funding things. But it comes back to the actual production and the fact that, we have $80 oil right now, and the state is producing almost 500,000 barrels per day. Where are you going to get that revenue? Even if prices drop to 60 tomorrow, when you're producing, the reason why it's so important to have a stable regulatory environment is because 500,000 barrels a day is a lot of oil. It not just contributes to state like energy security, it actually contributes to national energy security, which we can talk about. But it's so important to think of all the ramifications of the tax benefits to that go to the state, the jobs, everything. And so you can just say, you can't just say we're going to ban drilling completions, but we'll keep that production, because you can't necessarily guarantee that, because the people who produce oil and gas, guess what? They're also the people who drill and complete those wells. And then companies like, we have a frack company in Colorado called Liberty Energy, and they frack a lot of wells in Colorado. There are other companies that also frack wells in Colorado. What is the incentive for, that's their home office is here. So I'm just going to go out and limb and say that, hey, these companies that are based here in Denver may want to go elsewhere if they have no business in Denver. So I am obviously very, very fired up about this. I think that papers like this are really, really good to put numbers in context. But can you dive into that a little further on? I'm sorry, I went on a rant there. On the revenue pieces, that $2 billion figure, that 400, the 400 plus million that goes to schools, and then I think your comments on the jobs thing, I think we can circle back and talk about that as well, of where the production is located, but the fact that you have a lot of, educated engineers that are living here in the Denver metro area.
Yeah. Well, you hit on an interesting point that I think is the relevant piece, to why we're working with you, and I think why we do this paper to begin with. I give a lot of credit to the fiscal analysts and the individuals that are tasked with coming up with the estimates on 500 plus bills every session. I don't know how they do it, to be honest. And they have a very limited scope. By law, they are limited in what they can really account for in their economic and fiscal impact analysis that's attached to the bill that the legislators theoretically are reviewing and understanding when they are debating the bill. So for us, it's critical to do this work to get that information before the elected officials as part of the debate, as part of these hearings, so they have sort of the full range of information on the ramifications of what they're voting on. So to your point, the fiscal note analyzes some of the direct revenue implications to the state and local governments. They have about a $900 million impact by 2035. They say as a result of about 60% of the production value being lost. It's about $900 million state and local impact, again, by 2035. So, our numbers are somewhat related. I think they don't give you the full picture. Let's say carry that out another couple of years when the declines are even larger. But they also don't do any of this dynamic analysis to try to understand, how the loss of the upstream oil and gas activity would translate to the broader economy. So in our report, we report by 2035, 6 years, I guess, after the ban, the range of fiscal impacts to the state when you account for the full, again, I use the word dynamic, but really what that means is if you lose, the jobs in oil and gas, you lose the investment, you lose the supply chains, you lose the dollars that are going into these communities, propping up residential construction, propping up, local retail, propping up, and it's more than that. The professional service. Right. It's everything that's connected to this. The full fiscal impact is between about by 2035, about 5.9 billion and 3.8 billion annually, and that grows to where we'd see a reduction in about, by 10 years between about 4.6 and $7 billion reduction in state and local tax revenue. That's almost $50 billion, up to $50 billion over a 10-year window in a state where we are perpetually having discussions over new fees and how to fund services and whether we should cut our income tax. We have it's always interesting to me doing this type of work on oil and gas it's just massive, the scale of these impacts. And the body of research we're doing on our other policies, when we're looking at key fights around foster care youth, when we're looking at fights around again school funding, we're talking about $10 million that legislators are trying to come up with, or
Right.
right, that we're trying to budget around, and we're talking about, in this case, 50 billion over 10 years. It's the scale is something that is just it's just astonishing, and has ramifications across so many other areas, and we just kind of lose sight, I think, sometimes, of how significant this one issue could be if we don't take it very seriously.
That's a exceptionally good point. I think that, that's why I say, people always, come back and say, well, it's just about money. Well, the money matters a lot, and revenue matters a ton. And so when you're talking about tens of billions of dollars, or multiple, initial couple $1 billion, and then that the scale billion B is a big number. Whenever you put a billion to it, it's a huge amount of money. And again, as you point out, the state is fighting over, hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions of dollars. You have nothing to fight over if you don't have the revenue to begin with. And I think it's really really important to put that in context, because you have to, you have to enable an industry that just wants to do business in the state. They do it pretty well. They have very low emissions. They have very stringent, some of the most stringent air emission standards in the world is in the state of Colorado. And so they've already had I think, I think in many cases are actually too stringent and onerous on business in terms of it doesn't foster more development. I mean, the state of Colorado could actually have far more oil and gas activity if it wanted to, because the geology is so phenomenal in the Denver Julesburg Basin. It's just not a very pro oil and gas state. And that's what's so incredible, is that because the state has not been so pro oil and gas, and the fact that we're producing nearly 500,000 barrels per day, and the fact that we have all this revenue really bodes to, it's hard to wrap your arms around the industry if you haven't been involved in it and really appreciate it. But it's a really resilient industry. It's filled with pretty amazing people, and there's a reason why when people get involved with the oil and gas industry, they kind of fall in love with it. And it's because there's a strength of the people and the community, and the people that want to do good. And I don't know if you go to, I mean, Weld County is where a lot of this production is coming from. Nearly over 80% of the production that we're talking about is in Weld County. And Chris mentioned earlier Proposition 112, which, if you go back, there is a very old podcast I did on before Proposition 112, in my old podcasting days before the videos and everything. And it was such a big deal then. I mean, in the industry pushed back and everything, it was defeated. But then Pulse came into office, and obviously SB 181 was pushed through, and it really was game changing. And it's sort of been taken. I think everybody's sort of taken the pill and swallowed it. But I think the industry, it's really important. I think that they're listening to this, that they understand what the common sense to is, and understand the work that you do, because I think it's just exceptionally valuable, and why I'm so privileged to be part of it. But you have to put these. The industry has to support this stuff. People in and outside the industry have to realize that it is not just the industry we're talking about. Because something, I think people are not also appreciating, and we can get into. I want to talk a little bit more about the jobs. Maybe we can circle back that to the end, because we touched on the revenue. But is the actual emissions point is that, bills that are anti-business, or things that are anti-business, or whenever you put a word ban on something, I mean, just think about when when you prohibited, I know it sounds really simple, but the prohibition of alcohol didn't do much to reduce the consumption of alcohol. There's a reason why it was ended. So when you prohibit or you ban something, you have lots of ramifications that happen with that. And so just prohibiting or banning the drilling completion of new wells in Colorado, to your point, is not going to change the consumption of, or the demand in Colorado. And it will increase costs to Colorado consumers, because you have to move that crude oil into the state. And the quantifications that you put on are fantastic in terms of the data of, okay, this is the economic impact, these are the jobs lost. But then the reality is that from a simplistic standpoint, the emissions do not go down. And the basis and the whole premise of this bill is that we have to reduce emissions. And I want to remind listeners who may know have heard this, but Colorado contributes less than 0.3% of global CO2 emissions. And so when we're talking about global CO2 emissions, if that is indeed what you're trying to fix, and that's, to me, there are many, many issues in the world beyond just CO2 emissions, but that's the goal of this bill, is to reduce CO2 emissions. If Colorado is only 0.3%, and global CO2 emissions, to my knowledge, do not have state borders or country borders, and global CO2 emissions are on the rise, you are just playing whack-a-mole with global CO2 emissions. So it does not make economic sense for the state of Colorado to kill themselves to reduce these emissions, which, by the way, US oil and gas production only contributes 1% of US CO2 emissions. So it's really a drop in the bucket, even for state emissions. So it doesn't do much but put the industry out of business. And the data that you put in here is so good. It's so good because it actually shows, which I think a lot of us knows, that you would actually increase CO2 emissions, not decrease them, because you have to move that crude oil into the state. So do you want to walk through listeners through, and you can rip through any of that comment, interrupt, etc. But if you want to walk through listeners the emissions section, and I think we can circle back to the jobs thing. I would love to hear about that because I think you put some really good pinpoints on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We got some data from the US EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program that is a bottom up data set reported by a range of producers across the country that showed that the Denver Julesburg basin, the upstream production within the Denver Julesburg basin, the emission intensity is on the lower side. It's well below the national average. It's one of the lowest sort of emission intensity basins in the country. And if we were to, let's say, take the production, the 346 million barrels of oil equivalent, when you combine oil and gas, you get the measurement that they use in their emission intensity barrels of oil equivalent. Take those 346 million barrels of BOE, produce it across the country from producers of a similar type. So we sort of controlled for similar type of producers and similar type of ground, essentially. And if you do that, so you redistribute Colorado's production across and you weight it based upon where we're seeing production, the majority of production occur in these basins, you would actually see an increase in emissions of more than 900,000 metric tons. And again, it's just one measurement. It's really, I think we did this in order to speak directly to the bill, to speak directly to the intentions here. But one way to look at this, and I think a perspective that people should have on this, if you put the two pieces of this report together, the economic impacts and the emission impacts, for every job lost that we analyzed and we talked about earlier in the conversation, growing to more than 180,000 jobs lost annually here in the state, and you're at the same time you're increasing emissions by more than 900,000 metric tons. For every lost job, you're seeing emissions increase by about 5 metric tons. And I think that point alone should give anyone considering this pause, because the ramifications, I don't think, even get to the intention of what the policymakers are going for.
Absolutely. And so can we let's talk about those emissions a little bit, because there's some commentary on this that I think is really important for businesses in Colorado that are not just oil and gas, is to realize that when you're going after, when you're attacking CO2 emissions like this in the state, it's very anti-business, and the impact can be, yes, you're going after oil and gas right now, but the next can be beer, the next can be just any business in Colorado. And it's really, really important to put this in context, because you have to have businesses to thrive, right? You have to have a business to have an economy and jobs. And Colorado is becoming a very, very expensive state to live in, especially Denver. So I think that this attack on emissions, people can say, they can bucket it and say this is just about oil and gas. It's not. Actually, you have to be very careful with this, because one, it doesn't actually reduce CO2 emissions, but two, it's not just oil and gas. It's going to be other businesses. And so we have to think about these as anti-business legislation that have to be understood in that context. But so the qualifications for quantification for some of those numbers of the actual, it's increasing emissions, not decreasing, which we both state very clearly, is because one, we're not impacting the consumption of oil and gas consumption within Colorado. And if you're declining production within the state of Colorado, you are having to import it. I don't think this paper is able to get into, I know this paper's not able to get into the local refinery, the Suncor refinery, and the fact that we have a local refinery that consumes domestic crude oil. And if that refinery does not have access to enough domestic crude oil, it's importing that crude oil, which means its costs are going up. Transportation costs for that. The transportation alone is right, has CO2 emissions that are impacted with that, but it's the cost that I think is extremely important, is that you're paying more for it. So whenever we see outages in the Suncor refinery, we actually see price implications to Colorado consumers, from gasoline to diesel to jet fuel. And that's another big thing, is that the jet fuel, this airport, the Denver International Airport, moves a lot of people around the world every day, not just in Colorado, but in across the U.S. and across the world. And that has access to local jet fuel. And so all the costs, people have to realize that flight costs will go up, airline costs will go up, jet fuel goes up, diesel prices go up for Coloradans, gasoline prices go up if you are not domestically refining that. And so it's really amazing that, the access to local domestic crude refined at a local domestic refinery. Yes, you're still paying the market prices of $80 WTI, but if you don't have that, you're paying way more than 80 WTI, because you're paying all that transportation costs on top of it. So sorry to move that back to cost, but I think the emissions component of that is relevant in the transportation sector, that just, to me, inevitably goes to cost.
No, it does. And I mean, as I unfortunately have to do when we write these papers, but if I were to turn around and be my biggest critic, I mean, that's what I would say, is that ultimately, I think while we're talking about the job loss and the sector loss, maybe Coloradans will, it's 200,000 jobs. It may not affect me, but actually, in fact, everyone will pay as a result of those higher fuel costs, as you alluded to. I mean, I think the gas that's going into our electric systems and is projected to be used in our electric systems for decades to come, again, will have to largely come from out of state. That has transportation and emission and cost implications. The refining, again, that is providing fuel not just to DIA, but to our transportation systems throughout the state, will face higher costs of importing more fuel. So, again, I go back to, one place to go back to is the state report from the Department of Energy, the greenhouse gas roadmap, that talked specifically about why they don't recommend a ban on production, citing that ultimately it hurts consumers and largely impacts lower income consumers. I mean, to some degree, raising energy prices is a very regressive tax.
Right.
And so, I would love to parse that out and be able to analyze that. And I think maybe in some follow-up work, we may have an opportunity to do that. But that is ultimately who pays. Coloradans will pay more as a result of losing that domestic supply.
Absolutely. And I think this is a great way to, I know these are very interconnected things. So we're going to loop them back together, because I think, cost to consumers is huge. And I want to talk about electricity, the cost of electricity in Colorado, the rising cost of things in Colorado. But it's fascinating, because everybody, when they're anti-oil and gas in Colorado, and if you read the Denver Business Journal, it's very tech, and we got all this tech stuff. Well, tech and artificial intelligence and anything like on the space stuff, everything in Colorado that people want to do, especially in Boulder, requires energy. And this country has been blessed and has the ability that we still have, we have a declining industrial sector, but artificial intelligence and anything tech consumes a massive amount of energy. And the only way for these businesses to succeed is to actually have access to energy. And a newsflash to anyone thinking it's going to be provided by wind and solar, it's not, because those are intermittent, poor forms of energy. And they're also really costly, which we can get into. If they weren't costly, Xcel wouldn't be asking to raise the rates on nat gas to pay for these really expensive, poor forms of energy of renewables, which are not actually renewable. But that being said, the jobs component, I think, is really serious, because we talk about, this cost to consumers that, it's Coloradans that will pay, higher electricity costs. We'll come back to natural gas in a little bit, but the jobs piece, 200,000 jobs, it doesn't, people can say that's not me. It is a lot of jobs. And when you lose jobs, that's why I think it's so important to think about when we shut down, if we're going to shut down coal-fired power plants, and we're going to shut down coal mines in where I'm from in Northwest Colorado, outside of Craig and Hayden, that's so big because it's, that is also revenue, right? It's the things that people are paying. So that the state tax, that the income tax that people are paying, also the sales tax. People are not spending money if they lose that job. And so when we think about the 200,000 jobs lost, I think, yeah, I think it's really critical for the oil and gas industry. And if you're an engineer and you're listening to this and you're sitting in a downtown office, one, you're pretty lucky because there's not that many completion engineers left that are, you must be good at your job and you have some job security in Denver because of the massive consolidation that we've had. There's not a lot of folks that have job, are in the oil and gas industry. You're increasingly being pushed to live in Houston. So the fact that you can live in Colorado, but you are downtown Denver and you have an education and you're getting paid a decent salary. And so those are the jobs that are at risk. And that decent salary means that decent salary is leaving Colorado and it's going to Texas or New Mexico. And that means that money is no longer, being spent in Colorado. So just jobs are huge, and it's not just the completion engineers and the people who are drilling completing these wells. It's all the other sectors. It's the tool rental sectors. It's the all the subsectors. It's everyone. If you go on a frac location, you don't just see one company on a frac location. You see the actual producing company that's drilled and completed that well, the company that's fracking, and then all the myriad of companies that frac company is actually working with. And so this supports so many cross businesses, that the jobs piece is really, really important. And I think that's why Proposition 112 was well defeated, partly because it was like, hey, we're going to impact jobs. And people who even were against the oil and gas industry were not against the state of Colorado, and they wanted to see Colorado thrive. And I think that this has to be understood in the same context, is that we can have a conversation about oil and gas, and you may, the folks that are going to hate it or keep it in the ground, that's one thing. But you have to realize that this state is 500,000 barrels per day, a lot of money's coming from that, and it is going to impact job, and it is going to impact revenue, and it's not going to impact emissions. And that's a reality that folks have to live with.
I think in these debates, it's critical to talk numbers, and that's largely what we try to do. But I do think there's a broader discussion about the role of policy broadly. I mean, we're a free enterprise organization. I believe firmly in competition and markets, and industries, companies get disrupted on a daily basis. And I believe that innovation ultimately will win, regardless of kind of where the policy landscape sets. I think the policy can intervene in a way that adds friction, adds costs. I think part of the challenge we're seeing here is it's creating this very uncertain environment.
Absolutely.
Around people who want to invest, who want to create change. So I believe that fundamentally our energy markets and our energy future will be dictated by innovation as it has in the past, and that will involve a range of technologies. I mean, that's going to involve a range of technologies that include oil, that include gas, that include solar, wind technologies. But I think we have to be realistic about what that role will be, and then more importantly for this conversation, what the role of policy is. I mean, if anyone that's listening, if you're not in the oil and gas field, consider if there was a rule passed to say, let's phase out your industry. I mean, that's the premise. Let's phase out through policy, as opposed to letting innovation sort of achieve improving outcomes, improving costs, improving efficiencies. And that's just not what we're seeing. Again, because of the premise of the legislation. But I just think we can't lose sight of the legal and the ethical and just the other ramifications of what the policy framework is. That is just different than you would face in any other business segment. Let's phase out, certain type of healthcare treatment. Like you can't even conceive of that in any other industry. But that's essentially what's happening.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to have conversations like this, have papers like this, have knowledge and power. And I think it's, as I am now an energy fellow at the Common Sense Institute, but clearly I have views and opinions that are not, that are not directly contributed to Common Sense Institute, which is kind of why it's such a great group, is that you're allowed to have that freedom of thinking, but you bring in really, really good policy experts. So it's just it's an incredible group. And I'm the stuff that you're putting out and working on, I'm really pumped about stuff going forward. But I'll have a separate podcast where I talk more about the investment piece, and I've talked about it with previous folks. I'm going to have some more Colorado operators on the podcast to talk about the investment piece. But I think you point to that really, really well, is saying that if this was any other industry, you have to think about just what would the investment ramifications be of if you're banning something. If you're saying, oh, we're going to phase out your industry, you're going to impact investment in oil and gas with this bill well before 2030, because already,
Right.
Proposition 112 and the uncertain regulatory environment, it was great that it was defeated, but then you had SB 181. You have severely reduced changed the ability, the whole orchestration and of Colorado oil and gas, the COGCC, the commission, to actually get permits. It's been completely changed and modified in terms of how you give a permit to an operator. It's not a business decision anymore. It's there's so many other factors and political factors, environmental factors that come into it, and there's a bias on it now to not give permits as opposed to give permits. And so you already have that in place. This is another step above that to say we're phasing it out completely. So you can't promise the state that, one, the production that the bill says that we'll just keep producing, and you can't promise that investment either, because the money, people that are saying, if I can't drill in 2030, why would I drill? Yes, they may drill up the permits that they have, but they're probably not going to spend the time, effort, and energy to put more money into a state that doesn't want them to do business there. And to the industry, you shouldn't actually. I mean, honestly, I would say that's not even fair. You should be going to places that want your money, and actually invest it properly. So it's an unfair to ask business leaders to continue. So the impact to investment, I think, is so critical, because you can't just, yes, you will still have some investment, but in terms of ongoing business and development and all the external things on midstream, on transportation, on the frac side, on all the service components, that's all going to be impacted, and that stuff you cannot control. So you can need those jobs. And something I pointed out with you, and we've talked about, is the external impacts of the jobs, like saying, I need qualified, educated pumpers that have the safety knowledge and the qualifications to safely continue to produce oil and gas in Colorado well after you stop drilling and completing. And you can't guarantee you're going to have those people once you've already implemented all these owners rules and regulations on these businesses. Those people can leave too, which means how are you going to promise that you can safely produce the oil and gas that you have with that existing production? And I think these are serious ramifications that people have to think about, is that you can't control something like this. Once the cat's out of the bag, it's out of the bag.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, in doing the work, we try to do our best to analyze impacts, communicate people these different dimensions, but there's always a high degree
Right.
of uncertainty, and things that we acknowledge we're not capturing. So, there are a host of other ramifications. We've touched on just a few of them here, but we will see where this debate goes. I'll be very interested in hearing where this debate goes in the committee, what some of the questions are, what some of the testimony is, to sort of elevate this debate here in the state, which hasn't, frankly, it's been it's been an ongoing saga, but we haven't had this type of economic discussion on oil and gas, I think, in a couple of years. So it'll be interesting to hear that committee meeting.
Yeah, and I think it's good for the industry to get a wake up call that this stuff is really happening, and the industry needs to be involved. And we can talk about this before we close the podcast, of how you get funding and donations. But if folks can put I think the oil and gas industry, they know this. I tell them this. I talk about oil and gas. I'm third generation, but you need to put your money where your mouth is, and the industry cannot just be asking for a lot and hoping that market intelligence and stuff just materializes, because the industry has not been spending any money on this stuff. We're seeing, look at the industry events in Colorado, whether it's Society of Petroleum Engineers or whether it's, Denver Petroleum Club, both great organizations, but they lack funding. And they need this stuff. And it needs to be where, I say this to oil and gas, but they need to be involved in the business community within Colorado and integrated and not just siloed. But I want to touch on one more thing before we close, and then we can talk about where people can go to find this paper, how ComSense Institute is funded, and ongoing work. And I think this is going to allude to some future ongoing work. But, immediately, when we first started talking and then this paper, I was thinking about, obviously cost to consumers and electricity prices and natural gas. Everybody were concerned, folks would be concerned about the decline in natural gas production. we're producing about 5 BCF a day, 5 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas in the state of Colorado. Now, there's some risk if you stop drilling, completing wells, that declines. Also, older production, you actually hit the bubble point in the reservoir and you can increase production at gas. So there's a reason why we have volatile oil production. If you look at the production curve in Colorado, it's pretty volatile because of the volatility in price, but also volatile because we've had, the regulatory onslaught that's been in Colorado. That's a direct, the production of Colorado is a result of both of those. Gas is a huge component, though, of saying, okay, having enough natural gas. I mean, and that's why I bring this up. The Xcel energy prices. I mean, everybody in Colorado has seen a massive increase in electricity prices. I am paying more than 3 times I was pre-COVID to heat this 1,400 square foot home, and it's really high. It's impacting me. It personally is impacting, as a small business, and small businesses are being impacted by this. So I think there's a direct connection to that, but it's also that the state and business leaders and everyone has to realize that energy prices, the fact that Xcel is asking for a price increase to natural gas prices when natural gas prices are well below $2 because they want to pay for these very expensive renewables and they want to get rid of the coal-fired power generation. There has to be a conversation about having reliable energy and access to energy and the ability for consumers and businesses to be able to thrive in Colorado. They're going to have you have to have affordable energy. And I'm curious if that conversation comes up in committee at all about, just affordable access to energy. But I know I'm asking you to push onto something not in the scope of this, but on electricity prices, I'm very much hoping that, we'll be working on stuff like this together at CSI. But it's just something I am really, really concerned about, that is tangentially touching this. It's not exactly touching it, but it is. And love to get your thoughts and comments on that.
No, I mean, a lot to unpack there. I mean, as you said, this is not something sort of directly accounted for in the modeling. So we talk about it only to say that if you were to quantify and analyze those ramifications across our electricity production market, the impact on price, affordability, and reliability, the impacts would be on top of what we are showing here. So we feel that what we've done here is very conservative when talking about the impacts. I'm sure some people maybe listening are arguing, well, you're not fully counting for it, you're underestimating impacts. And in what you just brought up, I think that's one area we are, but 100% something we want to, we should put on our docket, bring up in some of our conversations we're going to have here in the coming weeks about where we go with this analysis. And so to your, maybe to go back to your prior point, on CSI, and as we think about what we'll be doing going forward, energy is crucial. CSI, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Any contribution, anyone listening that is interested in getting involved is supporting us. It's a tax deductible contribution. So please, we always welcome your support. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can subscribe to our newsletter at commonsenseinstituteco.org, where you can find this report and many others. But we're always looking for people to come to our events, share our work, and get involved because, again, our mission is to get this information in your hands to help people be educated.
That's wonderful and a really nice recap. So the funding of CSI is individuals and companies as well. Do companies also fund you? And is it pretty mixed?
Yeah, we take, we're built on individuals. We have some grants and some philanthropic contributions, donations, and companies. I mean, we actually have a broad membership structure across a range of organizations. We don't do any work on contract. Like we don't act as a consultant doing work on contract, but we absolutely, engage with a range of organizations that are being directly impacted by issues to help us understand them, to help us inform our work, to help us ensure we're on top of the top, kind of understanding the top issues that matter for free enterprise. So yes, absolutely. Companies, individuals, philanthropic groups, we're trying to engage with anyone that is interested in analyzing and quantifying and communicating the impacts of major policy on Colorado, the Colorado economy, into the future. I mean, that's what we want to do: preserve and promote Colorado's free enterprise system for future generations.
I love it. And I love that it's also, I mean, it's an independent organization. So I think a lot of folks know that I used to work at a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., a think tank, and we were independent. And so, you can donate to these entities, and people would always push back and say, well, you're biased on oil and gas. And it's like, well, this is it's independent analysis. So X company or X person can donate, but they can't tell you what to do. And I think it's a really, you get really good people like yourself, which you're obviously, you punch way above your weight, and you guys do a lot more than I think for the size of your organization, and it's just awesome. So I'm really pumped to be part of it. And I look forward to it. I am hopefully we'll be doing more events and doing more stuff like this and talking. So listeners, you can look forward to more. And I have, there'll be more stuff that's coming down the pipeline for me, but it's all spiral up, and the stuff that we'll be working on together. So I'm delighted to have you on the podcast. Really, you've been a fantastic guest. And we will definitely have you back. We might have to have depending on where this goes in committee, we might have to have a follow up as well.
Fantastic. Well, Trisha, we're very excited as well. I'm excited. You've been a pleasure to work with, and this is going to be. It's unfortunate under the circumstances. I always say this when we dig into these big issues that are as potentially damaging, catastrophic as they are. I always say, under the circumstances, it's a pleasure to work with you. But I think in this case, it's very true. So looking forward to more of these conversations and more work together.
Absolutely. And I will, to listeners, thank you again, Chris, but I will put links in the show notes to this stuff, to Common Sense Institute, to this paper, and I'll do the bill as well. But thank you very much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.